Hi, everybody. Okay, so here we are back with the lessons for this full stack exercise. So this is another part of the exercise. We left off where we built out our front end a little bit, and now we're back to the server side, which is where we should be for a server side course, Java backend. So we're going to go ahead and start filling that in. Where we left off was we have a 404 error when we submit our address, and we've got it sending the data, but now we need to do something with that data. So let's let the errors or the lack of functionality drive what we do next. And so with that in mind, we don't have something to receive this message. So there's the first thing that we need to do. So let's go ahead and go back to our code. Now here's our main function that starts up, and this is a Spring Boot main, right? So just like we had our Hello World command line program, Spring Boot is using main to launch our Spring application. And in this case, it's our demo application class, which was generated for us by Spring Initializr. All right, so now what we're going to do is add a controller. So Spring has a lot of great documentation on how to use it, and there's a concept of it loading. So it does a lot of things for you, which makes it easier. I think it's a good framework to learn from. I kind of like to do raw servlets, but in the interest of getting up and running quickly, and it's pretty straightforward, so not too confusing once you get it. You really only use a couple things in Spring Boot for the most part. So let's just learn those parts, okay? So what we need now is a controller. So a controller is something that's going to receive the message. So let's go ahead and we can go to a browser here and look at the documentation. So what you're going to do is do Spring Boot controller, and you'll see documentation on Spring on how to build these things. They've got really good tutorials. They've got a 15-minute tutorial here that you can go through on how to set things up. But basically what a controller is, and we're not going to do, this is a POM file here, so Maven POM file. We'll learn about that later in a little bit more advanced lesson. We're using it now when we run this thing from the command line. All right, so this is something you can go through. What we're going to do right now is just go through a controller itself. Now this is a REST controller, and they have actually just regular controllers. So let's go ahead and see what we can do with this. All right, so there's a couple things we can do. We can add the controller here to our application, and that would turn this application into a controller as well as the application, and then we could put our methods down here to receive the request. A small application like this is probably okay, but when you get into reuse and maintainability, you actually want to break things up, and you want to do things with a single purpose. So your class should have a single purpose, your function should have a single purpose, and so right now this thing has a single purpose, and that's to launch the application. So let's not break that rule right now, and let's just go ahead and make another controller now, or another class to hold our controller. Now we could make another package too, and I'm gonna that's a really tough one because this is such a small program. It starts getting things more complicated the more layers you add. Something you do for a large application is not necessarily something you have to do for a small application. So let's keep it small for now, and then let's go ahead and break it up later. So let's go ahead and do a new file. And actually that's now tempting me to put it in the main application, but let's not do that. All right, so what should this be called? Addresses is what we have, right? And let's just say addresses controller .java. Okay, and so this fills in for us. We've got a class, and that's what we want. We're going to use the at controller from Spring Boot right here. So that what that does is tell Spring that this is going to be a controller class. So we'll take in requests from HTTP. All right, let's see. So what do we want to do? We want to receive a message. So how do we receive? Now this has a lot of documentation. Does it have a post example in it? So I'm just going to type for the word post and search for it. Okay, that's telling us how to curl it. So let's do this. Spring Boot controller post. Post mapping example. That sounds really good. Okay, and then we've got a bunch of tutorials here. Let's go ahead and stick with spring.io and see what this one says. I don't think I've ever seen this one before. You don't usually look for these, but let's see. So this is an entity. Typically the entity is saying this is something I want to save in a database. And it's typically a noun. So in our case, it would be the address. Okay, and let's see here. Configuration class, we don't need that. So RestController looks like we want to, let's go ahead and use a RestController here instead of a controller that we did. Followed their documentation here. And we've got a post mapping, and we'll make ours say addresses. So let's go ahead and use RestController instead of controller. And if it pastes funny, you can just type it. I actually don't know if RestController is a thing here. It is, okay. All right, so there we go. So now let's go ahead and see what they did here. So they have a post mapping, and then they've got a function body. So let's go ahead and do that. So we have a function, so it's going to be a public. Remember our lessons on functions. This is going to return what do we want to return right now? I don't even know. Let's return nothing for now. And we're going to say save address. Okay, and then we're going to do what they did here. They've got an @request body, and then they're taking in a plain old Java object, or in fact the entity that we saw up above. So let's go ahead and do that. Case matters, by the way. So request body, and we're going to take in an address, which will give us an error, meaning that it doesn't have it. So that's the class it does not have, which is good. That's what we want. We're going to let the errors and the stuff that's missing drive what we're doing next. All right. In fact, let's just go ahead and return our address too. Okay, so we're going to save it. And in this case, since it's a save, we're probably going to add an ID to it, and we'll send it back so that way the client now knows the new ID. Now you'll see here that this is in red, and if we try to compile it, it would say we couldn't compile it because we don't have an address. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Command dot here, or Control dot for you if you're on Windows. Let's see. So we've got import address. We don't want that. We have a class create address. That's probably not bad. Let's do that. All right. And we could put this in a entities package, but we're not going to do that right now. We're just going to keep it small, and if we end up breaking it up later, we will. All right, so address class. This is the thing that's going to be somewhat equivalent to what we have on the client side, which is the address that we're sending over. All right, let's leave that empty for now, and we'll let something drive us to fill it in. All right, so now we're not returning anything. So let's return address. Okay, we're missing something though. This is a function, but we don't have the post mapping to tell it to get here. So we've got post mapping /addresses. So let's do that. Oops. At post mapping, and it had /addresses. Now this addresses could be anywhere in a function or on a class. When we add more things, we're probably going to want to move this up to the class level and say this whole class handles addresses, right? So a single purpose. This is an addresses controller. And actually, it probably should just be address controller. But we'll leave it this way for now. And let's see what this does. And actually, I'm tempted to change that name. We'll change it when we get back. Let's see if this even works. All right, so let's restart our server. Control-C that. Let's go back to our main application and run. All right, so now something should be receiving our request, so we should no longer be getting that post error. And let's see what happens. Back to our address book. Here we are. All right, so if I post this now, let's see what happens. Let's go ahead and close this so we can see what happens to the network. We got a 406 error. What is that error? 406. Cross origin. Why would I be getting a cross origin? We're coming from the same origin. .406. Okay, I don't know what 406 means, and I don't actually see the error. Let's look for it. All right, let's see what 406 means. Not acceptable client error. response code indicates the server produced a response matching a list of, oh, it can't produce a list, can't produce a response from the list matching. All right, so why not? What do we have in our controller that's causing us a problem? Oh, maybe because it's an empty class? Could be. Let's try that. Let's have it capture an email. Let's make this private. And then let's go ahead and let it make a getter and setter. You gotta spell it right though. All right, create getter and setter. There's that. Okay, so now we've got a getter and setter. All right, let's see what happens now, because I'm a little confused. And this could happen to you too. Okay, and so I'm getting an error. I'm going to leave all these errors in here. So something about body needs to be completed. Lost one of those. All right, one more time. Let's shut the program down and restart it. Okay, let's see what happens now. Back to here and close that and submit. 200. So it's the fact that our class didn't have anything in it. All right, that's good to know, right? I usually like to let the program guide things, and I guess that did it, having it empty. So our response, okay, we got our email sent back to us, so it's working. All right, so let's fill in a little bit more. And we'll do it the same way we did it. So let's do private string phone. And even though phone's a bunch of numbers, we want to take it as a string because it could have formatting or any other kinds of things in it, so that's okay. All these will be strings. Okay, address 1, address 2, and I'm typing here, so you might hear clicking. Private string city, private string state. I am glad we changed those other names. These are something I can remember. Zip. Okay, and that should be it. So then I wonder if this thing can generate all. I'm sure it can. I know we can do it one at a time. So if I do command dot, I'm just doing command dot on each one of these. Okay, and it mixed them all together. So that wasn't as good as I wanted it to be. Let's see, let's move email address up to the top, and it looks like it did them all in reverse order. So that's kind of funny. All right, so that's all right. It doesn't matter what order they're in. It just would have been nice if it kept them in that order. So let's go ahead and run this now. Oh, what did that do? All right, hit the trash can. That'll kill that. And let's go back to here and restart it. No big debug mode this time. I don't think we need it. All right, when we get this echo back now, it should have all the fields that we have. Let's see. Okay, and now we've got all the fields. Okay, that's working. So now we just need to have it save, which would be nice. So here in our controller, we want to do something to have it save. Now, again, sticking to that single purpose thing, we should make an address service for Spring Boot. So the controller's purpose is to basically convert the post request into something that can be saved. And that's its single purpose. If it also then saved it into the database, that would give it two purposes, and that's not exactly correct. So the right thing to do would be to make an addresses service. But let's go ahead and change this to address service. I don't like the plural here, so I'm just gonna see how we can maybe right click and rename. Will that work? Refactor. Is rename an option? Nope. What if we do it over here? Rename. Okay, I like address controller better. And let's say, go ahead and let it do it. Okay, so it changed it to address controller for us. Addresses is okay for plural here because it's going to, that's what the collection of things is the addresses, but this address controller is controlling an address, so let's do it that way. All right, so let's run and make sure our application still runs the way we expect. Okay, and don't need to refresh because nothing changed here. Go ahead and run and click on this, and looks like we've got what we wanted. Okay, so let's save it somewhere. All right, so back in our address controller, we need to do something like save it. So we're going to import a class, and so in Spring Boot, it's called auto wire. What that will do is automatically wire it'll automatically add the class in here so that we can use it. So we're going to auto wire an address service. Okay, and in Java, uppercase or camel case, I don't know, I think every first letter of the word is uppercased, and then lowercase for the first, for the variable name, and then uppercase for the rest. So that way we know the difference between a class and a variable. All right, and this is telling us, of course, that this address service does not exist yet. All right, so let's let the error drive what we're doing. Do command dot, create class address service. I could have created it into a package, but let's go ahead and leave it here. All right, and now this is a service. Okay, Spring service, you can see that. Org Spring Framework stereotype, I think is what it says there. All right, so now this is a service, and it's an empty service right now because we're going to let the work drive what we're doing. So we'll go back to our controller, and now we've got an address service, and it's saying it's not used. We're going to use it right here. So address service, and we're going to call save, and we're going to pass it the address. Now this doesn't exist yet, so we should get an error. Okay, it's saying save doesn't exist. And what we want to do is let that go ahead and return back to us. So, and it's going to return an address back to us. So let's go ahead and just throw that right back to the client that made the request. All right, so then I'm going to put the cursor on that and hit command dot. I'm going to create method save. And so that created it, and I'm going to jump into that with, I think it's function F12. And so I'm in there, and we're going to save our address here. Now, if we had a database, we'd be creating another layer, which is, I believe, repository. So there'd be a new class created that's repository, and we would go ahead and put everything in there. I don't think we need to do that at this time because address service's job is to save something into something, and we're not going to have a database, which would be a nice thing to have a repository in front of. We're actually going to do this in memory, and it's okay to have it here because we don't have a central database. We're going to do this in memory, and each service class can have its own instance. So remember what we did for maps back when we were creating, I think it was user logins. So we're going to use a map here. Let's go ahead and do private map, and we're going to have it mapped by the address's ID, which will be a string, and it's going to store the address. And that's going to be addresses. And we'll make it a new, let's make it a new map. Does it need to be sorted by anything? No. So let's just call it a hash map. Okay, and if we don't have it imported, we'll command dot, and that should import it. And command dot again. No code violations there, but there is one over here. And now it should be happy. All right, so addresses is not used, so let's use it. So here we're going to go ahead and do a put. Oops, addresses.put. This is from one of the Java Crash Course lessons, and you can refer back to that if you want to. One of the exercises we did. Okay, so now we're going to take address.id as our key, and I don't think we have an ID yet. And then address is what's going to get saved. And then we're going to go ahead and return the address. Okay, notice here it's complaining that we don't have an ID field. And that is correct, we don't. So let's go ahead and let that create an ID field for us. All right, and then I wanted to F12 into that. I hit F11 by accident. Okay, so ID is here, and that's public because we referred to it by its property value instead of by a function. So let's go ahead and do this, because otherwise it would have created us a get ID, which is what we want it to do. So let's go ahead and let it do that for us here. So create a getter and setter for ID, and it again mixed up the ID and the email. So let's go ahead and put this here, just to keep the ID together and the emails together. Okay, so now we've got get ID, so let's hop back to our service and get IDs now. Oh, it changed it for us, that was nice. Okay, so now it changed it for us to get ID, and it's going to put this in here. Now get ID is empty. It was new. It wasn't set by the user. The user doesn't know what the ID is. So we're going to go ahead and set it to a unique identifier. And so let's do this. In Java, there's a UUID, and that's a unique identifier. And we're just going to go ahead and let it give us a random one. And we're going to let that be a toString, because we want to have to let it go ahead and have. We could do it by the UUID itself, and that should be fine. But let's go ahead and do it as a string, because that's what's going to get sent back and forth from the server. And we're going to assign it to a new local variable. And I don't like the name string. Let's call this ID. Okay, so that's going to make an ID here. But notice what's going to happen. As soon as it comes into this function, it's going to run this, and it's going to create a new ID. We might already have one. This is a save method, so it could be reused again to save things. So an address could already have an ID. So what we want to do is use one of our conditional statements. And let's do if address.getID equals null, which means it doesn't have a value. Then we're going to assign it to that ID that we generate. So then we're going to do address.setID. And now when we put it in there, it's going to go ahead and send it to us. Now put, does that return anything? It returns the address. So it returns, associates the address, returns the previous value associated with the key. We don't want the previous value, so we're going to go ahead and not even capture that, and we're just going to go ahead and return this address, which will now have an ID on it. So let's go ahead and see what happens when we do this. So we're going to save it into here. So let's go back to our controller. We're going to return the address that this thing gives to us. So it should have an ID when we see it on the other side. Okay, we're sending it without an ID, and then hopefully we should see an ID when we get it back. Okay, so let's see what happens. So let's go back to the application itself. Let's close this, and then we'll run it. All right, let's see what happens. All right, when we save, there's our ID. So we've got a unique ID saved in there. So let's go ahead and do another one. Let's call this one email 2, just so we could see something's different. And let's call save again. And this UUID starts with C2F5. And this one starts with 45C7, and the email address is email2. So that's interesting. So now everything's saving to our fake database in memory, and it's coming back. So how do we prove that out? Let's make another controller method over here. So we've got a post mapping. Let's do a get mapping. So remember the verbs for HTTP RESTful calls is get will get data, post will create data, update, put will update data, and delete will delete data. So we've got get, post, put, and delete. Those are the main ones we work with. So we're going to make a get mapping, and then later on when we want to do an update, we'll do a put mapping, and then when we want to delete, we'll do a delete mapping. All right, so let's go ahead and do a public. Let's return a list of all of our addresses. So a list of address, and you'll remember this from the crash course lessons that we did. Let's just say get addresses, or let's just call it something more generic. Let's just say get all. It doesn't matter what we call it on this end because the mapping is what's actually sending it here. All right, and it's just get all. There's nothing to get to put in here as the list. All right, list is not known, so I'm going to hit command dot there, and that'll import it. All right, get all. So now we're going to ask our address service to get all. All right, it doesn't have that yet, and we're going to want to return whatever it gives us. So let's go ahead and put the cursor there, command dot, create that method, and let's F12 into it. All right, so it's empty, it's returning null. That's not what we want. We actually want it to return the list. So we're going to return a list of these addresses. So let's go addresses dot, and we're going to get the values collection here. And you'll notice that it's complaining, and it's a type mismatch because it doesn't match. The collection does not match the type of list. So let's do this. We're going to do new, and this is from our array lesson that we did in the crash course. So array list of address, and we're going to let it take in those values right there. All right, it doesn't know what address array list is, so I'm going to command dot that and import it in. All right, now that get mapping should actually return this. So let's go ahead and restart the server. Back to the demo app. Okay, we're running. Let's see what happens. Okay, we've got addresses. It should be empty now because we've restarted the server. We're in memory, so as soon as we restart it, everything goes away in memory. So let's go ahead and clear this out, and let's go ahead and save one of these. Actually, let's see our empty list first. Okay, so we've got a get on addresses. Okay, ready? We've got that happening, and that is a 405 method not allowed, so it's not seeing our get. So back to our controller, because I didn't put the mapping, so that could happen to you too. And this is probably that case where we want to move it up to here and let that be the address. You can keep it down here and keep it that way for other things, but there's a way to refactor this to get the common thing up to this class. Let's leave it here for now, and we'll do that later. All right, so let's restart the server. All right, now we should be able to get a mapping. I like leaving the errors in because that way you see that even someone who's been doing it for many, many years has errors like that, and it's no big deal. It's nice to have the program actually tell you what's wrong, so you can just do it without having to remember all these details. All right, so that's an empty list, and that's what we expected. All right, so let's go ahead and add email. We'll add phone. And zip. All right, we'll save it. We've got one in there, so let's go ahead and add a second one in there. Let's do phone, email 2. How about add 2s to all these? Oh, how do I add that one to this? Let's do add this 2 here and just delete that one. That way it's different. All right, ready? Save. All right, that's good. What do we get back? Got a different ID, email 2, phone 2, address 2. Looks good. All right, so now let's go back to our addresses get. And we've got data. So it's kind of all jumbled together, but let's see if we highlight it. So there's one record, and this is called JSON format, JavaScript object notation. So here's our array start and our array end. Here's object start curly bracket and an object end, and then a comma, and the next one starts. So the first one is, all right, and it's a hash map that we're storing it in. So we're getting them in the order that the map stores it in. So we don't really know what that order is going to be. So address 2 came out first in this one. And we might want to do some sorting on this. So we'll do that in one of the other parts. But for right now, we're actually getting data. So we're actually saving to a kind of a fake database right now. So let's go ahead and let's do kind of a different test here. Let's add some real data. Let's say Bob, and let's do 333 555 1212, and he lives, sure, 1234 Main Street sounds good. And he's in any town, and it's any state. Let's go ahead and make it a real state. Let's make it Alaska. And then we'll go ahead and give him a zip. I don't even know what the zip code in Alaska is. Let's just do that. All right, so we've got back Bob and his phone number. And then let's go ahead and see what we have. Bob should be in there now. Where's Bob? There's Bob. Okay, so it's got his unique ID, and there's his data. All right, so when we come back, we're going to go ahead and format this into our form so that we have the form here and then the list of addresses down here. All right, that's it for this one. See you in the next lesson.